Okay, Joey Clark, it's good to see you this morning. I like our new time on Sunday. It's kind of like a brunchy sort of discussion.
Oh, yes, and I love brunch. The only thing we're missing are mimosas.
There was a time when you couldn't buy those in the Deep South on Sunday because, of course, you're not allowed to drink before one in the afternoon.
Yeah, yeah. You leave. I wish that could be just left to social etiquette and they didn't have to enforce it by law or anything.
Yeah, but I mean, in the end, I think it's a well-known fact that if you drink before noon on Sunday, you probably not go to heaven. So this is, this is
Well,
just a
I've had a few milk stout beers, not this morning with breakfast though. I feel angelic actually after drinking one.
you feel predestined.
Indeed, yes, yes.
Okay, so look, the reality we're confronting here today is with the ominous and I think sort of delightful fact that whomever gets to be president come November, whatever, who gets sworn in 2017, is going to be the most unpopular person in the United States and probably the entire world.
Yes, very, very happy about this fact. Very happy about it because it is true. In modern American political history, we've never had presumptive nominees or front runners this unpopular with negatives this high. And you've written about this.
Within their own party too.
Yes, and you've told me about this a few times. I tried to help some of the hosts I work with this week. They were very despairing after the results this past Tuesday because they were left with, well, where are we going from here? And I was trying to make the point, and I've heard you make the point, that this could mean a good thing in the future, that we'll have this dark moment before this hopeful horizon appears.
Well, it's in my lifetime, it's always been the case that people who wanted freedom, by which I mean, just like leave me the heck alone. Let's do the American thing and just let people manage their lives and keep their stuff. I mean, this is not complicated. I'm not here advancing some gigantic apparatus of libertarian theory. All right. This is just a plain sense of, can people be free, just left alone and not bugged and manage their own lives? That cause has always had to, and be peaceful and, live in midst peace, has always had to hitch itself to some front runner or to some national political candidate, to whom we have to, sort of defer or infuse with all of our hopes and dreams. That no longer seems possible. And to me, that's actually a good thing. I mean, it more clearly delineates the agenda of the freedom movement or the liberty movement, whatever you want to call it, from people from the ruling class, essentially.
Yeah, I think the disillusionment with government in general, government's at an all-time low in terms of standing, and this is in terms of efficiency, getting the job done, trustworthiness, all these things. And I tend to think it will lead to, okay, imagine how many people came to the libertarian fold, especially from the left. In particular, I remember one video by a young woman, very talented, named Carrie Welder. I wish sometimes I could, muster the rage and indignation that she can throw out there in such a brilliant way. But it's a famous video that made the rounds. Even the conservatives I work with who are stumping for Trump these days love this video. It was Carrie burning her Obama shirt with a butane torch. And it's a whole video about how she bought into the hope and change. And now she became disillusioned and realized, well, it isn't that the Republicans will be better. It's the whole damn system's bad. What happens if Trump does get the presidency? He has promised to make America great again and then fails. I think you'll see people even more disillusioned to the point where DC doesn't work whatsoever. My only worry is that when you look at certain parts of the government, areas where people still hold a lot of trust is the military. Now, I think that has more to do with trusting the individuals who serve. And to be honest, I would be one of those people. For a lot of the uniformed men and women I've met, I would go, yeah, I trust that person. They usually seem like stand-up people. But that could lead to candidates coming out of the military, high up generals, these sorts of people running for president. I think that trend could happen, Or we could get a trend that you have talked about that would be, okay, now once people are so disillusioned, let's try local control. Let's try the classical liberal, federal system as we used to have in this country. That DC has failed us so much.
Well, there's a number of scenarios that I like to try out with you, and I can just think of it as, 4 quadrants, really. Like on the top, it's Trump, Clinton. On the side, it's more state, less state, and, which bucket, I mean, considering the Trump victory, for example. Well, let me just put it this way. I worry about a Hillary Clinton presidency, not because I'm so much worried about Hillary Clinton, which we should always worry about who the president is, but I'm afraid of what happens to the movement in the 4 years in which a woman feminist internationalist member of the establishment, is lording it over the rest of the country, and the Trump movement itself becomes, ever more reactionary and dangerous and violent and seething for power. And, once that sort of anger kicks in, this is not a libertarian impulse. I mean, the results are actually, well, we've seen them in history, what happens. So that concerns me very much. And my scenario is, look, let's feed the red meat to the rightists, to the fascists now. And then the disillusionment sets in. But Joey, here's what concerns me. By the way, is my internet connection working well at all?
Yeah, I can understand you. It's freezing a little bit, but I've understood every word you said.
Okay, yeah, we might not be able to do this podcast. We might have to cut this podcast off early just because, I mean, the infrastructure where I happen to be is flaking out today. The other thing that worries me, I mean, an alternative scenario is that Trump becomes president, and then these people taste blood, and they become, the equivalent of the Mao's Red Guards. I mean, the Red Guards were always way more extreme than Mao himself, and I tend to think that's true of the Trump movement. The Trumpsters, there's a core of them that are far more radical and extreme and nativist and potentially violent than Trump himself intends them to be, and they get worse rather than better, under a Trump presidency. And under the other alternative is that Hillary Clinton becomes the president. The nomination of Trump destroys the Republican Party. They're demoralized. They realize that they wrecked the world, and they have no future, and they go away like many other know nothing movements that come and go. So that's the opposite of the scenario I've laid out. What do you think about it?
I think it's quite possible. Well, on speaking to Trump's followers, I agree with their fervor. And I tend to think when you get a cult of personality around a so-called great leader or strongman, that the scariest people are the wooden-tongued followers, where they don't use their language and their minds to think creatively or independently. Everything is just canned, ideological, or in the case of Trump, it's just all about the personality and the power that he claims to uphold. And this is the more dangerous way that this gets spread. For instance, there is a couple of women, 2 sisters, named Diamond and Silk. We've had them on our afternoon drive show, and they do these quick little YouTube videos called Stumping for Trump. They're quite entertaining. They're very, very funny, but they're in the can for Trump. And if you take away the humor of it, underneath it, it really is this blind march, and it creates this, as I would put it, million-person Kevlar around Trump. So I wonder what would happen, though. I'm not certain of where it would go. Say Trump gets the nomination and he loses, and we hope it goes the way of every other know-nothing movement. But I tend to think the Republican Party would just be lost in the wilderness for quite some time. And I don't know exactly where they would go, because I tend to think some of these folks backing Trump would double down on, it's because the establishment didn't cooperate. They were shitting on us for too long during the primaries. I think it'll just be more infighting. Does this maybe create an opportunity for a different type of Republican Party, for maybe a libertarian party to sort of come up and pick up the scraps? I doubt that. I doubt it. I tend to think this is a 2-party country, And unless you have an utter collapse of the Republican Party, which I don't see happening because there's plenty of money and party infrastructure there, I tend to think you'll just get another 8 years of Democratic rule, and then we'll see where the Republicans go. Again, this is all, a lot of these things we're speculating about have less to do with ideology, in my opinion, and a lot to do with events, just basic geopolitical events that go around the world. This is why I'm so sad with today's Republican Party. I saw for a moment there in 2013, based on the events of the day, you had the Snowden leaks and you had the president trying to go into Syria. And you saw on the right, in the Republican land, a lot of people speaking the language of liberty and meaning it, saying, no, don't go to war in Syria. Oh, what is it with this mass surveillance? These are people who used to defend George W. Bush for waterboarding, for a lot of the stuff he did. But now that Barack Obama is doing this mass surveillance, oh, they're realizing the value of civil liberties. But then you go another year or two, ISIS comes on the scene, and you get the refugee crisis. You get all these scares, and the Republican Party makes a fast turn back to strongman politics, back to we must build up the military, we must kick the immigrants out, we must control our borders. It stopped being a limited government party altogether, other than maybe they might lower your taxes a little bit. And I highly doubt they'll lower taxes for most people, for the common man. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future, because I think events like these shape a lot of where the common man goes, where the wooden tongue followers go. It depends on what the media is scaring them about. And I wish it had more to do with ideology. Like, can we throw them red meat, or can we, put more pressure on them with another left-wing regime? I wish it worked that way, but I tend to think it's a little messier than that.
Well, if Trump loses, I want him to lose very, very badly. I want it to be, like McGovern's loss to, I think it was Reagan.
Yeah, it was Reagan.
Because that shocked the party, and they didn't recover for another 10 years. The Democrats. It was the prevailing notion that the party had committed suicide,
right?
And it was because it was too left wing. Actually, I mean, McGovern wasn't such a bad guy, as it turns out, but anyway, that's another question. But there was a prevailing ethos was, look, we can't keep doing this extremist lefty stuff. We need to have somebody who's a real person, a real somebody who's culturally is not so ideological. And the result was Bill Clinton, and the party recovered under Clinton, right? But it was a long loss. So. It's possible that if Trump just really does wreck the party, just fundamentally, and they'll lose the House, the Senate, and the presidency, then the Trumpsters are widely blamed, for this. And in the end, they are a tiny minority. Actually, it's a little bit of a fluke that Trump is got the plurality of votes here, because he's running against really these implausibly weak opponents. It's hard to imagine that at some point somebody thought there was a strong lineup of candidates, which there really wasn't. So I mean, it's a little bit of a fluke. And by the way, I'm not entirely sure you're right that Trump represents anything beyond. It really represents an ideological shift. I kind of resist this, mainly because when I first heard him speak, it was at Freedom Fest in 2015, and he wandered into a room full of people who like freedom, who like the gold standard, wanted limited government. They're anti-left, and they had no interest in Trump whatsoever or any of his issues, like none. And he stood up in front of them. They all treated him like some sort of weirdo alien. But I saw him sort of basically hypnotize our room of people with issues they had never thought about, namely immigration and trade, and that sort of nativist, we are being pillaged by the foreigner. Your very identity is at stake. The demographics don't favor you for your personal genetic survival. You need to throw yourself into. And I could just feel over the course of really, it was an hour and a half. The room went from almost 100% skeptical to now about only 40% skeptical.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like he just invented a scenario. I mean, and like hypnotize this crowd. I mean, I walked into a room where there wasn't a single person there who thought that there was any problem with international trade. I mean, like, we trade with China, we trade with Canada, we trade with Mexico. Trade is awesome, whatever. We have a global economy now. And immigration, nobody cared that much about immigration. I mean, there might have been a slight, issue lingering from the old Buchanan campaign, but not really. It was, and he just like some sort of magical wizard implanted all these thoughts in people's brains and tapped into this sort of deep nascent sort of fascism in the right-wing mind, and just brought it to the fore. It was weird to watch it all happen, but just because he was going to go places nobody else was willing to go.
Well, and it does tap into just a basic us against them mentality. I think this actually, the more I talk to Trumplings or the Trump supporters, and even people that aren't explicitly supporting Trump but like what he says on trade, I think this is a failing of many in the so-called conservative movement. If conservatism ever meant something about small government, limited government, and at its base, liberty. If Ronald Reagan was not to be made a fool by saying, I think the heart of my philosophy is libertarianism, well, they failed, because I talk more and more to the Trumplings about free trade. And I just come out and boldly say it. I am for unilateral free trade. Well, what does that mean? It means even if the other nations aren't even playing by the rules, we as Americans should be able to buy goods and services from wherever we wish. How is restricting our freedom at home going to make any sort of fair situation out of them restricting freedom abroad, the other nations? And what I can't for the life of me, and maybe it's because it's election season, but it goes back to that old beginning of Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. And I sometimes thought I was saying it too much, and I was just pounding the table too much about this, but we are not the government. The government is not us. And I would say that over and over again. I stopped saying it because I thought I was saying it too much, but it's back. Like when I try to explain to folks that, why are you looking at trade as this battle of nations, as this almost warfare model, rather than looking at it as, okay, when we buy things from China, they get our dollars. Now they're buying hotels here. And yet Drudge Report shows a story under all sorts of terrible news about immigration and certain violent illegal immigrants, picking out the anecdotes to represent the whole class of people. Then they put under that China buys hotels. Of course, it's not China themselves. It's one company in China buying these hotels. To me, I see this as a good thing, that generally this is a great thing. And yet maybe it's just that old ideas never really die. They can sneak back into the consciousness of the public. And it makes me think of how, as much as the victories of the classical liberals of the late 18th century and early 20th century or 19th century, they go into the end of the 19th century and they think they've won. And yet out of nowhere comes this just this backlash of the ancient regime of the old actual conservatives. And they didn't even see it coming. It was almost complacency.
Yeah. And listen, I think your analogy is exactly right. And this really does require some commentary and thought. And it's like, how does liberalism in the classical sense get diverted? I mean, how did we go from a year ago, almost everybody on the right, or the conservatives or libertarians, I mean, just people on the right, I would say generally, basically the bourgeoisie. How do we go from a general consensus that the problem is the government to a new consensus that the problem is foreigners, and them? I mean, that happened just in the blink of an eye. And in a strange way, Joey, I think this same issue happened in the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century. There's a widespread impression that, in the age of laissez-faire, that the answer is private enterprise and the problem is government. And then just like overnight, it was a demographic panic swept everybody. And, the ruling class, instituted a kind of technocratic managerial Leviathan state, that suddenly began to control people's lives. and it came about through a similar demographic panic. Best-selling books on fear of the mongrelization of the race and so on. Suddenly, the enemy became the other, outside our borders, and nationalism and socialism suddenly took hold, and it's weird. And here we are in 2016, and we're repeating the events of 1908, all over again.
Well, and I really do think the enemy is nationalism. That the people thinking the government is tied up in their very identity as a nation is leading them down a dark road. And it's not just the foreigner. It also then comes back to those damn bums running the government. It's not that we hate the power they have. They're just not using their power correctly. And we don't have, we shouldn't tear down the one person or the institutions are running. We need to get the right people in there. So we're back to this old trick. I had a friend tell me a long time ago, and he was talking in particular about Southern conservatives. He says, Joey, as much as they claim otherwise, they don't hate government. They just hate government that isn't theirs to command.
Yeah.
And that's coming back, right. And now the foreigner is the target.
That's right. Yeah. So to the extent that this kind of nationalist nativism hates the government, it's only because they perceive the government as being an enabler of internationalism and sort of foreign invasion, of goods and people, so which is the greatest lie ever told. I mean, the state uses nationalism obviously to its benefit. I mean, the idea that somehow Washington is being ruled by internationalists, globalists who have a multicultural borderless philosophy is preposterous. But these are the lies that people tell themselves.
Well, and they're being told. I have to say, I look at my own profession, talk radio. After I get done with our afternoon drive show, I will drive home, and for about 5 minutes, I can take listening to Laura Ingraham, and she talks about this all the time, and that we have to be Americans first, and we got to assimilate people if you want to come to this country, and this globalization thing has failed. Like, how ignorant of history this is. I mean, maybe in the short term, it's displaced a few workers in America. I think that has more to do with the fact that we've fallen in the last decade from 3rd in economic freedom rankings to 16th. That has more to do with it.
You just spoke truth. Absolutely.
Yes. And then it reminds me of something Trump says all the time. We're going to have a country again, folks. We're going to have a country again. We're going to have borders. We're going to have a wall. It's going to be a big, beautiful wall with a big, fat, beautiful door, but we're going to have a country again. And it makes me think of these classical liberals who I think their secret was giving this comprehensive and optimistic vision, and they monopolized the language of progress. And to where those folks were saying, oh, if you have stringent border controls, if you're requiring things like passports and all, you were primitive. You were backward. And now the language of progress is no, to have an advanced country that looks after their people, we need to control this flow of goods, services, labor, culture. And if your culture needs to be backed up by force, it's probably not worth saving.
I mean, I hope if people are listening to you, they understand just the level of sort of sophistication from which you speak here. I mean, it's actually a little bit mind-blowing to consider it. There is a parallel between the left progressives of 100 years ago and the Trump supporters today, in that and insofar as that they're basically reactionaries with an atavistic view of the past. They want to restore it using statist means, and that's what they have in common. It's always been the case that the pushers of state power are looking backwards, and the pushers of freedom and liberty are looking forwards. And you're right. We need to capture that. We need to recapture that somehow. Yeah.
I tend to think that is the biggest failing sometimes of the libertarian movement, the so-called liberty movement, is that it's not capturing that old classical liberal feeling. And instead we focus too much on, like somebody asked me the other day, what do I think of the word conservatarian? And I said, I do not think of it, or at least I try not to. It rolls off the tongue like marbles hitting the floor of what was, nice sanctuary. Now, I don't mind. I don't mind the sentiment behind it, that we should work with everybody. But don't just make libertarianism about the so-called conservative movement. Work with everybody. Try to win offices at the local, state, federal level within both parties, try to get it within the bureaucracies. Slowly but surely, you have to work wherever in the culture. I think I'm doing a lot more studying of the classical liberals, and they were people that had this depth of understanding that it wasn't just about politics. It was about art. It was about science. It was essentially everything came under their vision of liberty, including the back to the point about having the language of progress and understanding of history, that man has for most of his life lived in serfdom under tyranny, and that we can have a society where peace is the norm. We can have a society where liberty is the guiding principle. And I think libertarians too much are sit back and go, well, yeah, maybe someday liberty could be our guiding principle. I'd say, no, tomorrow you can start implementing a libertarian project, a classically liberal project through politics. I don't think you can legislate to where I think both you and I would like to go, Jeffrey, anarcho-capitalism or just some form of market anarchism. I think that has to be more built out as we become more prosperous and more enlightened. But I think tomorrow you could start legislating more of a classically liberal program. But it takes actually standing up for the ideas, being skeptical of nationalism, being skeptical of the people are always right, generally being skeptical.
In a way, I think Trump is wonderful in this respect. I mean, I've noticed that writers at National Review and elsewhere who despise Trump's sort of power mongering and cult of personality and sort of power lust and everything you identify with Trump are starting to like ask themselves what exactly is wrong and what can we replace it with. So you're starting to see sort of the rise of a libertarian spirit in some of those circles, like National Review. I mean, I for the first time in really my life, I'm now reading National Review and going, this is pretty good material. This is pretty good content. Yep. And so there's a funny way in which I think the best way to beat back Trump is, in fact, the only way, is by rediscovering a sort of a core classical liberalism.
Exactly, and it has to be bold. You can't hide behind this conservative label. This last election locally in Alabama, we had a few people trying to run against the incumbents. In my own district, a woman named Martha Roby, and then also statewide, Senator Richard Shelby, who's been up there, I think, 40 years in the Senate. And in particular, Shelby was run against by several people. But one of the guys was named Jonathan McConnell. And Jonathan McConnell, if I look, I heard what he said. He tried to build himself as a true conservative who'll get things done and be a vocal leader. But I look under the hood, the man's a libertarian. Like, why are you hiding this? And you don't have to call yourself a libertarian, but put yourself in the mantle of more the founding of what the basic principles of the nation are, and stop it with this. Oh yeah, we'd have to secure the border. Again, it's always a short-sighted throwing of red meat to people just to win an election. He loses. But I've seen this time and time again. You get these Tea Party types or conservative types who, if I or you have a conversation with them, they are clearly classically liberal, but then they feel sheepish about using that language. But it is, you look at Byron, you look at a lot of these poets from that period, the language of liberty is not only true, it's like the veracity of the language is amazing, but it's also strikingly beautiful. You capture this in a lot of your writing. It is, and I try to do it in a lot of mine. When you really put your mind in that place, that liberty can be our North Star, you can find such because it fuels the imagination. Because you're not saying we know where we're going exactly. We're just saying that slowly but surely, when you look at every given human problem, it can be solved with liberty, and wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? And the fact that people shy away from this language, maybe it's the fact they don't even know that it's possible. Maybe they haven't read enough of this stuff to emulate it. But that's what I would start telling folks who are in politics and want to see a change, is start being boldly for what you are for and start going back to the classics, because it's a language that can speak I think the only way we get rid of nationalism, which I think is our number one enemy, is by sort of deconstructing nationalism. You don't just come out and say nationalism is bad. You're an idiot for saying I want to be proud of America. That's not going to win people over. But start redefining what nationalism is. Start redefining what it means to be proud of the United States of America. I say that on air all the time. I am proud of this country, but it's not because of any particular government program, these sorts of things. It's more about the founding ideals. And if you can make being proud of the country about upholding those basic ideals, I tend to think you can go a long way of undressing nationalism and getting it back to being more about loving your neighbor and less about loving everybody through the power of government.
Well, I think those are beautiful sentiments. I just read an article the other day by Larry Reed about John Bright, the great free trader of the 9th century, and what you're describing, it very much reflects his own thinking. I mean, he cobbled together a propaganda apparatus for free trade that was all about down with the insiders who are robbing you, and you're being pillaged by tariffs, and the importance of Britain integrating itself with a global division of labor, and other sort of peaceful things, and the consumers come first, and lots of apparatus there, but eventually they won, and it was one of the great victories in the history of liberty, actually, and they did it against reactionary forces that were trying to preserve the old order, So, hey, Joey, I think that my connection is too shabby for us to have the level of conversation we usually have, just because I think we're a little bit off here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hate that because I desperately wanted to continue to the end, but I think we should call it at this point and just pick up again next week. Is that going to be okay? And I'll have a better connection then. Yeah,
sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay. I'm so sorry, my friend, but it's good to see you, and we'll talk soon, all right?
Good to see you, Jeffrey. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.